Hello, and welcome to the Throw Nest. I'm Cody, and I'm here today to talk about stinger transitions. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to define a stinger transition as an animated transition between two scenes of video that incorporates a transparent background. The stinger transition lets you see the first scene transition into the second scene in the background of the transition itself. It might just be easier if I show you. And that's it, really. It doesn't have to be all that fancy. You can add audio if you want. You can do all sorts of crazy things. But today we're going to be making this very simple stinger transition. We're going to be using two programs that are both free and open source. The first one is Inkscape, which we're going to be using for our actual image assets. And then the second one is Natron, which we're going to be using to animate the assets across the screen. I'm going to leave links to both of those down below. I wanted to let you all know that I'm streaming over on Twitch every Monday, Thursday, and most Saturdays. I'm streaming content like this, media production, music production, software engineering, and gaming. So definitely come by and say hi. I hope that you find this video useful, and if you do, please like, sub, and hit that little bell thing. It really helps the channel grow. Okay, without any further ado, let's jump right into it. Alright, so here we have Inkscape open, and before we get started, we're going to just change up a couple options here to make it a little bit easier to work in. Head over to Document Properties here. If I was working on a project and I knew that I needed to stay within a certain size constraint, I might find the border useful here. But because we're going to be exporting a few separate assets out of this file, I don't think that the border is going to be very helpful for us. So I'm going to turn it off. Go ahead and click the X to close the document's properties. And then make sure that in the top bar here, you change this from millimeters to pixels. So the first thing that we're going to do is make sure that our colors are very accessible to us. I'm going to go ahead and create a color palette by making a bunch of rectangles. You can make I'm just going to make any color rectangle I want. And with that rectangle selected, hit Control D to duplicate it, and then while you're holding Control, drag it over. Continue doing this for all the colors that you're going to be using here today. I have 6 in my color palette. Once you have all your rectangles together, you're going to want to click on one and open up the Fill and Stroke menu. For my color palette, I'm using these colors right here. I use a website called Coolers, which is a handy tool to help you generate color palettes. So go ahead and select your first color, make sure that you have your hex that you want to use and put it here in the RGBA field. Once you do that, click on this square right over on the right that says Swatch. You can see all of the swatches as you add them in the Swatches menu here. Now go ahead and do the same thing for the rest of your colors. So once you have all of your color swatches set up, you actually don't even need the base objects anymore. So I'm going to go ahead and delete those. The next thing we're going to do is create 3 canted rectangles. Go ahead and click on the rectangle and square tool and make sure that you're in pixels instead of millimeters. I noticed that whenever I swap to a new tool, it swaps back to millimeters automatically and I have to manually change it to pixels again. There may be a way to lock that down, but I'm not really sure what it is. So we're going to go ahead and with our purple swatch selected, create a rectangle. Click on the selector tool, go over to Fill and Stroke, and make sure that the stroke style is set to 0 pixels. Click on Path and click Object to Path. This converts your rectangle object into a path that has nodes that you can access and move around. We're going to be using these nodes to shape our rectangle in just a little bit. With your rectangle selected, set its X and Y position to 0. Set its width to 1920 and its height to 1080. Since we're going to be building our stinger transition for a 16:9 resolution, and that's most commonly seen at 1920 by 1080 pixels, this is where we're going to start with our rectangle. Click on the Edit Paths by Nodes tool, and then click on the bottom left node here. We're going to cant this node out 400 pixels to the left, so set the X position to -400. But don't forget, instead of millimeters, we want pixels. So go ahead and make sure that you're on pixels and then set it to -400. For our top right node, we're going to set it to 400 higher than 1920. So we're going to set it to 2320. Once we have our rectangle set up, go ahead and click the select tool and drag it out of the way. With it selected, hit Ctrl D to duplicate it. And with your new rectangle selected, go to the swatches and click on the blue color. Go ahead and do that one more time and then create the red-pink rectangle. These are going to be the 3 rectangles that we're playing around with here today. The next thing that we're going to build are these little tiny pill shapes. In the Stinger transition, these are the shapes that fly across the screen. Go ahead and click on the light blue surfy looking color and then click on a rectangle. With our rectangle selected, if we convert it from an object to a path and then go back to the nodes, we can try to create this pill shape by adding a node in between these 2 nodes and then trying to shape it like this. But that's a little tough, and I found out a much easier way to do this. So what we're going to do is we're going to click on the circle shape and we're going to create a circle. Now, let me delete that. When you're creating your circle, if you hold Control, it'll lock in the proper shape. Make sure that you have a circle that has the same height and width. Click this lock button to lock in the height and width together, and then change one of those dimensions to 80 pixels. With your circle selected, hit Ctrl D to duplicate it, and then move it off to the side. Go ahead to your rectangle and make sure that with the aspect ratio unlocked, make your rectangle 80 pixels high and 320 pixels wide. We're going to turn on snapping, so go over here and click this snapping button. Click the snap bounding boxes button and go ahead and click all of these on. They all snap different parts of shapes together, and I find that they're pretty useful to have, but you may want to turn them off if you find them annoying. With our snapping turned on, grab your circle and drag it over the rectangle. You should see that it wants to snap in the middle, just like this. Let it go, and then grab your other circle and do the same thing to the other side. Select all 3 of those objects, and then hit Ctrl G to group them together. Now that we have one pill shape, it's very easy to click on it, hit Ctrl D to duplicate it, and then to change it to our other gray color. Once we have our pill shapes figured out here, we're going to create a couple of them in a cluster so that we can move them as one piece across our screen during our transition. To do this, we're going to turn on the grid document property. Go to File and Document Properties. Click on Grids. Click New Rectangle Grid. For spacing Y and X, set 80 pixels. Close the Documents Properties menu. And make sure that on the right side, you have Snap to Grids enabled. This is going to allow us to snap these shapes to the grid, which will make it a lot easier to make sure that they're spaced appropriately. Make some room for yourself, grab one of your rectangles, and set its X and Y position to 0. We're going to create a bunch of these pills and lay them inside the original 1920 by 1080 box. You should see that the pill wants to snap to the grid. Just go ahead and scatter them however you want. What's nice about the grid is that because all the snapping is 80 pixels apart, we're creating a bit of a language here with 80 pixel rhythm. It's okay too if you have some of them hanging off a little bit. Once you're satisfied with how many pill shapes you have, go ahead and take the red box, or whatever box you used, and move it out of your way. Now we're going to make sure that we export all 4 of these assets individually. The red box, the blue box, the purple box, and then the pills together. Click on each box and go through Export PNG Image. Make sure that your export area is set to selection. Click Export As and find the path that makes sense for you to store this at. When you select your folder, make sure that you name your asset appropriately. Once your path is all set up, go ahead and click the Export button. Repeat this step for each of the other rectangles, making sure that you set an appropriate path. The last thing that we need to export is all of your pills together. To make it easier to work with, we're going to actually export it at the same resolution as our other shapes. Go ahead and grab one of your rectangles and hit Ctrl D on it to create a duplicate. Drag the duplicate down, deselect the rectangle, and then select all of the pills. Hit Ctrl G to group them together. Grab the pills and pull them over your rectangle. If your rectangle is on top of the pills, then you can click on the button in the top menu that says Raise Selection to Top. To more accurately align these 2 shapes together, open up your Align and Distribute menu. Click on your pills group and then shift click on your rectangle group to select both of them at the same time. Where it says Relative to, make sure that you click Last Selected. That will move the pills relative to the rectangle since we selected the rectangle after the pills. Under the Align section, hit the Center on Vertical Axis button, and then below it, Center on Horizontal Axis button. This will align the pills vertically and horizontally within the rectangle. Once you're all aligned, click on the rectangle one more time by itself, and in the bottom left, click on the X. This will set the fill to none. With the rectangle still selected, click on Export PNG, name your path appropriately, and then click Export. Now that we're done in Inkscape, you can close this project out if you'd like. So here we are in Natron. Natron is a node-based editor that will let us do the actual animation part of our stinger transition. The first thing that we want to do is take a look at our project settings up here. By default, it's already set to output at 1920 by 1080, which is exactly what we want, so we're just going to leave that alone. The default frame rate is 24 frames, and the default project size is 1 to 250 frames, so 250 frames total at 24 frames per second. For the sake of our project, I'm going to use 30 frames per second. And because I want this stinger transition to be 2 seconds long, I'm going to make it go from 1 frame to 60 frames. 30 frames a second, 30 frames times 2 for 2 seconds, 60 frames. You'll notice that down here in the node graph editor screen, there is a single viewer node. And there's not too much else going on here right now. We're going to import the images that we just exported out of Inkscape. To do that, go up to the top of the left nav bar and click on the icon that has the arrows down and up. It says image when you hover over it. Click on read. It's going to ask you to pick a file. Open up one of your colored rectangle files. Now we see that we have this read node with our blue PNG inside of it. If I drag the arrow from the blue rectangle over to the viewer, we're going to see that rectangle in the viewer. Let's drag this off of the viewer because we're going to do something else instead of connecting that directly to the viewer node. Repeat this step for your other assets. Import all of your rectangles and the pills. Once you're done importing all of your assets, you may want to rename them. I find it's a lot easier to keep track of them. So one by one, double click on the node to focus it in the right hand side of the screen. At the top, you'll find the name area. You can rename it to something that is easy for you to remember. I'm going to rename my rectangles to the colors that they are, so I'm going to call this one purple. Click off of it to save, and then double click on the next one. Make sure that the current name matches the name in the node. It's very easy in Natron to think that you're editing a node when you're actually editing a different node. I'm going to name this one blue. I'm going to name this one pink. And finally, I'm going to name this one pills. Now that we have all of our assets named, we have to figure out how to move them across the screen. To accomplish this, we're going to use the transform node. In the left-hand bar, go up to the icon that has the directions going up, down, left, and right. Click on this, and then click the transform button. This adds a transform node that may automatically be linked to your viewer node. If it is, break the link. We do not need it to be connected just yet. We're going to want to be able to move each of our images independently, so we're going to need a total of 4 transform nodes. With the first transform node selected, press Alt-C to duplicate it. Do this until you have 1 transform node for each of your images. Just like before, I find that it's easier to rename the transform nodes to be something that you will easily be able to find. I'm going to name my transform nodes transform space and then the name of the image that I'm going to link into them. So this first one is going to be called transform purple. The second one I'm going to call transform blue. The third one I'm going to call transform pink. And the last one I'm going to call transform pills. Once you've named all of your transform nodes, grab the arrow coming out of each of your image assets and connect it to the source of the transform. By doing this, we're setting the transform node's source to each of the image assets so that it reads the image and applies the transform to that image. Now, if we take one of the transform nodes and connect it to the viewer, we'll see that image in the viewer. But you'll notice that if we take a second node and attach it to the viewer, now we see this blue one, but we no longer see the pink one. The viewer can only take in one source at a time in Natron, so we're going to have to use a different type of node to help consolidate all of our images together. So break off these connections. In your left-hand bar, go up to the icon that looks like 2 squares on top of each other. Open that up and click Merge. The Merge node has several connection points going across the top. They all behave a little bit differently, but for now, we are going to focus on these A connection points. From the Merge node, grab the A connection point and drag it to the purple transform. Then grab the A2 connection point and drag it to the blue transform. An A3 connection point will appear, which you can drag to the pink transform. And finally, the A4 connection point will appear, and you can drag this to the pills transform. Out of the bottom of the Merge node, grab the arrow and put it into the viewer. We can now see multiple of our pictures in the view report at the top of the screen. You may notice that the width of the viewer has grown to be 2720 instead of the 1920 that we've expected from the project settings. If you scroll down to the project settings, you may find that the output format has changed to match the size of our images. Make sure that you select the output settings and set it back to be HD 1920 by 1080. Even after setting this output format, the viewer still shows 2720 by 1080. To fix this, we're going to import another read node. Go to your arrows at the top of the left-hand column. Click the Checkerboard node. The checkerboard node is going to serve as a base image for our merge node, which will then go into the viewer node. Because the checkerboard is going to match the size of our project, the viewer node will shrink to match the checkerboard. Click on the merge node and drag the B connection to checkerboard. In Natron, the B connection is the base connection. Once we've successfully wired up our checkerboard node, we can see that the viewer node has appropriately resized to be 1920 by 1080 pixels. Now that all of our assets are wired up, we have to start animating them. Across your screen, you will see this timeline that runs from 0 to 60. This is your frame timeline. Because we set our project to go from frame 1 to frame 60, we can see that this section of the timeline has a gray background. Make sure that you're at frame 1 before we start moving our nodes around. The first thing we're going to do is set the initial position of all of our nodes. For the rectangles, we're going to have them all on the right side of the screen, and for the pills, we're going to put them on the left side of the screen. Double-click on your transform purple node and make sure that it is the node at the top right here with the white outline. Towards the top, you will see a translate X value. Set that value to be 1920. This is going to move the node all the way to the right of the viewport. Repeat this for the blue and the pink rectangles. For the pills, because we want them on the left side of the viewport, we're going to have to set the X value to be negative. It won't be good enough to set it to be negative 1920 because the pills are larger than 1920. So we're going to have to set the X value to be negative 2720 to match the size of the pills image. Now that all of the assets are in the proper starting places, we can start animating them across the frames. If you remember what the transition looks like, it begins with each of the colored rectangles moving from the right side to the left side to be in frame. Then the pills go across from the left side to the right side, and then finally all of the rectangles exit out the left side. Let's begin with the purple rectangle. Double click on the transform, and we're going to start this animation at the very first frame. Because it's already in its correct starting position at 1920 X value, right click that and hit set key. This sets this dimension as an animatable value that Natron will keep track of. The way that I view this animation is that there's kind of three sections of it. The first section is all of the rectangles sliding in, the second section is the pills sliding across, and then the third section is all of the rectangles sliding out. Within that first section, the rectangles are sort of sliding in one after another. They're not all moving at the same exact time. To create this offset of movement, we're going to move over to the 16th frame, make sure that we have our transform purple selected, and set the X value to be negative 400. This is going to cause the entire purple rectangle to be in view. If you remember, we had an extra 400 pixels on each side for the canted angles. You'll notice that when you set the value to be negative 400, that value automatically turns dark blue. This is Natron helping us set this animation point up. If we go back to the first frame and then click play, we'll see that our animation from the first to the 16th frame happens just as we programmed it. You'll notice that the first time it runs through the animation, it's a little slow and choppy. This is because Natron has to sort of load that animation into the software. Go ahead and hit the stop button whenever you're done looking at it, and we'll move on. The purple rectangle should stay in frame for the majority of the middle of the animation, but it's going to start exiting towards the end. I'm going to pick frame 51, and I'm going to right click on the translate X and set key to negative 400. even though it was already negative 400, I want to make sure that when I animate it out, that it starts at negative 400 at frame 51. If we don't set this value here, then what we might find is that whatever value I set at the very end, it will start animating from frame 16 all the way to the end. By setting the key value at frame 51, we guarantee that from frame 16 all the way through frame 51, the X value stays at negative 400. Finally, click on the 60th frame and set the transform value to negative 2720 to match the size of the rectangle. So you'll see that the animation comes into the screen, stays, hangs out a little bit, and then exits the left side. Now that the purple rectangle is done, we're going to go ahead and do the same thing for the blue and pink rectangles, except we're going to offset these values so that they're not overlapping the purple rectangle's movement exactly. Double click on the transform blue node, go to the 6th frame, and then right click the translate X property and set the key at 1920. You'll notice that we're going to start the blue animation as the purple animation is already in view. Go to the 18th frame and set the transform blue's translate X value to negative 400. Then go over to frame 46, right click that negative 400 and set key. And finally, go to frame 58 and set that value to negative 2720. If we play our animation now, we'll see that the blue square chases the purple square in and then leaves just ahead of it. If you click on the dope sheet, you'll see a list of all the nodes that we've animated so far. We can see very visually that the purple transform node starts its animation first, but it is the last to animate out, while the blue transform node animates in after the purple, but leaves before the purple node leaves. If you've loaded the dope sheet and you notice that some of your nodes are missing, this is a common problem that I found in Natron. You can fix it by going to File and then clicking Reload Project. Go back to the node graph so that we can finish the pink rectangle's animation. Double click the transform pink node, go to frame 11, and then right click on the translate X property at 1920 and set it as a key. Go over to the 20th frame and set the translate X property to negative 400. Go to the 41st frame, right click that negative 400 and set key. And finally, go to the 56th frame and set that translate X to negative 2720. If you play your animation now, you'll see that all the rectangles enter, hang out a little bit, and then leave out the left side. Before we move on, I want to talk about animation curves. Go back over to the dope sheet. You'll notice that all of these keyframes have a Z in their little circle. If you right click one of them and hover over Interpolation, you'll see that there's a list of different interpolations that you can choose from. These different interpolations affect how the animation is done. For example, if I select all of these nodes and then I right click on one and set the interpolation to linear and then play the animation, after it finishes buffering, you'll see that the animation curve is very straightforward. It moves in at one speed always. If you instead set the interpolation to horizontal interpolation, it gives it more of an easing in and easing out property. If you play this and let it buffer, you'll notice that your animation is a little bit more bouncier. It's a little bit slower to start, and then it picks up speed, and then towards the end, it slows down right before the end. To see a more visual representation of this, you can click the curve editor, and you'll notice that with this interpolation selected, the curve is not just a straight line, rather it curves into the slope, and then curves out of the slope. Just to show you what our linear animation might look like, it's a very straight line. For this particular animation, the horizontal interpolation is what we're going to go with. Go back to your node graph, set your frame to the first frame. Now we're going to animate the pills across the screen. We've already set the pills to be sitting at -2720 when the animation starts. We're going to progress to the 21st frame and then right click on that 2720 and set key. This is going to have our pills start their animation at the 21st frame. Select the 40th frame, go to your Translate X property and set it to 1920. Hit enter. You'll see that the keyframe was automatically set to 1920. This is going to have our pills go across the screen. If we hit play, we'll see this animation in action. Stop the animation and go to the dope sheet. Now that we've added new keyframes for the animation of the pills, you'll notice that the nodes are not set to our horizontal interpolation. We are going to change them from the starting interpolation, but we're not going to use the horizontal interpolation. Instead, we're going to set these two nodes to be linear. I want the pills to fly across at a constant speed. Once you've set that, hit the play button. Okay, so this is our animation. Go over back to the node graph and let's figure out how to export it. In your left-hand nav, go back up towards the top to the image icon, click it, and click right. The right node is going to bring up a prompt for you to select where you want to write this animation to. I'm going to call this animation Stinger, and for the file type, I'm going to select MOV. I'm going to hit save. You'll notice that the right node appears in your node graph just like any of these other nodes. We want to set the source of the right node to the merge. Now, our right node will receive the same image that our viewer node receives. Double-click the right node. The reason that I chose to export this as an MOV file is because it's very important for the Stinger transition that there is a transparent layer in the background of the video. If I go to part of the video where there is some of this checkerboard shown currently, I want to be able to see whatever video I'm transitioning away from behind the Stinger transition. MOV is one of the file types that can support this. But before we actually see that this works properly, we're going to have to change the codec. There are a few codecs that support transparent backgrounds, but I've had the most success so far by using the PNG codec. It looks like the FPS is not set to match our project settings, so I'm just going to manually change this to 30. It's also very important that you click on this alpha checkbox. This is what lets the transparent alpha channel work on the video. Before we click render, which will write our file to the disk, we have to make sure that we get rid of this checkerboard background. Otherwise, we won't see the transparent layer and we'll just see a checkerboard instead. Go over to your checkerboard and drag the connection away. At this point, we're done editing our transition, so we don't really care that the viewport isn't exactly the same resolution as the export. When you're ready, click the render button. This is going to begin writing all of the data that we animated to the file. After it finished, you can open up the file and see the video yourself. I saved my video file here, and I'm going to be using a program called VLC to open it. It's another free program that opens movie files, and I highly recommend it. And the last thing to do is to play the video file just to see what it looks like. And that's it. We're done. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you so much. I know it was a long one. I really hope that you found something useful in there. And if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. I'm Cody from the Thrill Nest, and I'll see you all next time.